Welcome into Beyond the Red Carpet. I'm Francine Brokaw. Today I have Ivor Davis, who you might remember from a couple years ago when he had his Beatles book, but right now he's got a new bestseller called Manson Exposed. And it's hard to believe it's been 50 years since the Charles Manson murders and shocked all of Hollywood and scared us all to death, basically, and literally. Welcome, Ivor. Welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me back on the red carpet, and it's always fun to be on the red carpet.
We love having you here. We really do.
Good, thank you.
You know what? First of all, before we get into the details, how did you get involved in the Manson case?
Well, back here 50 years ago, I was a foreign correspondent in America on the West Coast for the London Daily Express, which had a big circulation of about 4 million readers every day. And they wanted me to cover the biggest stories in America. And then one morning, it was a Saturday morning, August the 9th, they said, get down to Cielo Drive in Beverly Hills because there's been a horrible series of murders. That's all I knew. So I jumped in the car, I went down to Cielo Drive off Benedict Canyon in Beverly Hills, and standing outside the gates of Cielo Drive was a growing band of television, radio, and newsmen, and we were all puzzled. We all wanted to know what's going on behind the gates, and then as the day wore on, we discovered the horrendous nature of the crime.
So when you got there, were you allowed to go inside, or did you see anything that was going on inside the house?
We were kept outside. However, you could look through the chain link gate, and you could see on the lawn, covered by white sheets, were obviously two bodies, and I discovered later that they were Wojtek Frykowski and Abigail Folger, who were on the lawn. And also I saw a car facing the wrong direction in the driveway, and it turned out to be that still behind the wheel of the car was another victim, a young guy called Stephen Parent, who was actually at the house. He was at the wrong place at the wrong time, because when the killers got there, they decided to get rid of him because he may have seen them, and they shot him.
Oh my!
Yes, it's another one of the victims. But of course, we discovered as the hours went by that Sharon Tate, the beautiful actress, Valley of the Dolls, who was 8.5 months pregnant, was a victim. And so was a friend of hers, a former boyfriend of hers named Jay Sebring.
And he's a hairstylist.
The hairstylist. He was the hairstylist to the big stars. I mean, he got $100 for cutting the hair of Frank Sinatra, Steve McQueen.
Well, nowadays that's nothing, but back then that was really
$100 for a haircut.
Really, definitely.
When I could get a haircut back then for $2.
Yes. So Sharon Tate actually is the main person that everybody talks about when they talk about the killings in that house. But Folger, she was an heiress, wasn't she?
She was. I mean, she was a very sweet girl, a young lady who'd been grown up in the San Francisco society because the family name was the Folger's Coffee Fortune. She'd hooked up with Wojtek Frykowski, who was a Polish wannabe actor, writer, who Roman Polanski befriended. And Roman Polanski said his friend could stay at the house. And that's how they happened to be part of the murder victim list.
Now, that house is famous for not only the murders, but there were a lot of parties that went on there continually. And so when you got there, were you aware that who lived in there or who had lived in that house prior?
Well, first of all, what happened was, I knew somebody famous was living there, and I was very lucky because 3 doors away from the house was an old friend of mine called Phil Freed. And I knew Phil because we played soccer together in LA. And so I'd been to the house of Phil, and I went there and said, well, who's living there, Phil? And he said, Sharon and Roman, and they do have a lot of parties. We don't mix in their circles. But there's always a lot of activity going on in that house. So I knew immediately who lived there, but of course they didn't tell us until much later who the dead bodies were and who were the victims.
Okay, so you filed your story then later that it was Sharon Tate and those people, and Roman Polanski was not there. He was in Europe at the time. And can you talk about how he was told and what his response was?
Well, you've got to realize that Roman Polanski had been making a film in Europe. I always wondered why his wife was expecting any day now, and he was off making a movie.
But I always thought that too. I mean, why would you go when your wife is about to give birth?
Yes,
that's Roman.
But that's Roman, and that's showbiz, if you like. And he was coming back in time for the birth of the baby. But of course, when he was told in London, he jumped on the plane. Warren Beatty was with him. Another friend of his, who was the head of the Playboy Club in London, came with him. And of course, Roman arrived back distraught, just shattered. And I must tell you that, well, first of all, there were so many rumors. There were rumors about there were drug orgies going on, that maybe it was a mafia hit, there was a drug deal that went wrong. I mean, we didn't know the reason for the murders, and we didn't discover the reasons for the murders until 4 months later. So you can imagine what happened. Hollywood was in a sort of paralytic shock.
Yes.
Hollywood just didn't know what to make of this. There was a safe neighborhood, supposedly, and all of a sudden there was this carnage, 5 dead bodies for no apparent reason.
And brutally killed, not just killed, but brutally killed.
We learned later on the extent of the carnage. I mean, victims were stabbed 15 to 20 times by the killers. So it wasn't just a bullet in the head or anything like that. And it was just brutality unbelievable.
And they wrapped something around Sharon's neck?
Yes, they had pillowcases around the neck. And there were all sorts of rumors about white pillowcases, so somebody thought it was a Ku Klux Klan thing.
Yeah.
I can tell you that the first 3 days of reports, the media went wild with all these suggested rumors. I mean, there was even a suggestion that because they lived dangerously, live freaky, die freaky. And then the thing about Polanski was, again, rumors were just all over the place. Roman Polanski had made a movie, Rosemary's Baby. And in the movie Rosemary's Baby, Mia Farrow gives birth to a baby who was spawned by the devil, supposedly. So all these kind of wild things. Roman makes these weird movies, weird things happen in his life. But Polanski was destroyed when he got back. I saw him. He had a press conference. He was in tears, and he kept saying Sharon was pregnant. Sharon never took drugs, not while she was pregnant. And so, again, innuendos flying everywhere, even a suggestion that maybe Polanski was behind this horrible crime, which of course turned out to be fake.
But he was definitely distraught.
He was. I saw him. I stood with him as he had a press conference at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel a few days later, and he was in tears. I remember that. And he just, I mean, he just talked about the cops being sympathetic, but the media being monstrous. And the media was a little bit crazy because the rumors were all over the place and nobody knew why this happened in a safe neighborhood.
But how many days later was the La Bianca killings?
Less than 24 hours after the Sharon Tate murders, we heard about the La Biancas, Rosemary La Bianca and Lino La Bianca, who was the head of owned a chain of grocery stores. They were murdered, and we discovered later on there were similarities, because the similarities were, and again it didn't come out until much later, that messages in blood were daubed on the doors and on the refrigerators at the house at Cielo Drive and at the La Bianca house. And police just assumed that they were copycat killings. And when I spoke to one of the cops, he said, no, these murders are not linked. He said that.
He did.
And he lived to regret that statement, of course, but he didn't know what came out 4 months later.
And earlier, how much earlier was Gary Hinman? Now, who was Gary Hinman, and how does he fit into all of this?
Well, Gary Hinman is the lesser known murder. But when I covered the story, I discovered the murder of Gary Hinman. And Gary Hinman had been murdered literally 10 days, July 27th, 28th, 1969, which was less than 2 weeks before the Sharon Tate murders. And without getting ahead of the story, because a lot of people don't know the intricacies and the details, Gary Hinman was a gentle musician, a teacher. He had music students. On the side, when he needed to make a few extra dollars, he cooked up mescaline in his kitchen and sold it to some of his students.
Oh, lovely. Okay.
Gary Hinman, yeah, that was you made some extra money on the side.
Why not?
And unfortunately, Gary Hinman came into the focus of Charles Manson. Charles Manson had a friend called Bobby Beausoleil. Both of them were musicians, both were friends, and for some reason Manson sent Beausoleil to Gary Hinman's house a week before the Sharon Tate murders to get some money. Hinman claimed he didn't have any money, and Hinman was brutally murdered and left dead in his house. Robert Beausoleil, who did the killings at the behest of Charles Manson, then took the murder victim's car, went to San Luis Obispo, and was arrested in the car that was belonging to the murder victim. And my theory, without getting ahead of the game, is that Charles Manson felt guilty, believe it or not, about the arrest of Bobby Beausoleil for the murder of Gary Hinman. So he set up the murders of Sharon Tate and the murders of the LaBiancas to try and persuade the cops, the detectives, that Bobby Beausoleil could not have killed Gary Hinman, because similar murders took place while Beausoleil was in jail. He couldn't have done it. And the reason he set up the murders and told them to leave these bloody signs in the blood of the murder victims, hoping that the cops would blame militant Black Panthers for the murders. I mean, it's a crazy thesis, but I believe that was the case. And the one that came out later on, which I'm sure we'll talk about the Beatles' lyrics, was a front, in my opinion.
Okay. Well, your book is amazing, and I learned a lot about Manson's early life. And he was just a little guy. I mean, how tall was he?
Manson it was always a running joke when he was interviewed by Diane Sawyer. At the end of the interview, he said, by the way, he said, everybody has me down as 5'1" and 5'2". I'm 5'4.5". But he was about 5'2". I saw him in court every day.
So how does this little guy get this group of people to, quote unquote, drink the Kool-Aid? How persuasive? Where did he learn all that? I mean, I know you said he took Dale Carnegie in jail, and so he learned a lot in prison.
Charles Manson, as a young man, got into trouble and ended up in all sorts of reform schools, which didn't help too much. And when he was in reform schools, he was badly treated and he was brutalized very much. And I mean, a lot of people come out of juvenile delinquency and they become normal citizens, but not Manson.
No.
But Manson survived in prison as a little man by using a quick tongue and a fast turn of expression. And besides learning all these how-to improvement books in prison, he survived jail. And when he came out, finally, at the time of Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco, free love, sex, drugs, rock and roll, when he came out, he saw all these young people, and he thought, well, I can control them. And he did. And he was so clever with his dialogue, and he ran into these young women who were looking for the meaning of love, the meaning of life. They were looking for a father figure, a sexual partner, somebody who would tell them what they wanted to hear. And Manson, besides handing out drugs like LSD and other drugs, managed to say, I mean, he knew what to tell them, that they believed what he said, and as impossible as this sounds, whatever he told them, when they all came together, they believed him. And they believed him so much that they actually went out and killed for him.
That's just astounding. That I can't wrap my head around it. It's just, I don't, okay. So let's go back to Manson again. He really wanted to have a music career. Was he any good at it?
In jail, he learned to play the guitar, he wrote music. He actually saw the Beatles on television on the Ed Sullivan Show, and he was enamored by the Beatles' music. Now, he did write music, and he was a troubadour of certain kinds, and he decided when he got out of prison that he wanted to become a rock star. And that was his main goal. And what happened was, by pure chance, when he was running his little family with his followers, who were about to swallow the Kool-Aid, as you said, his girls ran into a guy called Dennis Wilson.
Beach Boys.
The Beach Boys drummer. Mm-hmm. Now, Dennis was a talented musician, but a little bit of a crazy guy. I mean, he drank too much, he drugged too much. He
had sex too much. I mean, Dennis was way out there.
He was Mr. Excess.
Yes.
Exactly. And the amazing thing about Dennis was that the girls were picked up by Dennis hitchhiking, and they told him about Manson, and Manson told him about the Maharishi, and Dennis, being the generous soul that he was, said, well, why don't you come to my house? And he lived in a mansion on Sunset Boulevard in the Pacific Palisades. The girls came to the house. Dennis said, go swimming, I'll be back later, I'm going to do a recording at the studio. He came back 2 o'clock in the morning, and there was a bus sitting in the driveway, and standing at the front door greeting him when he got back to his house was Charles Manson.
Okay, so they just took over Dennis's house.
They did, but he invited them to move in, and so there was Charles Manson with a passport to fame, he thought. Mm-hmm. Dennis Wilson, the Beach Boys, and to his house came the Mamas and the Papas, John Phillips, mm-hmm. Cass, Michelle, and Neil Young, and every rock and roller on the face of the earth came to be entertained at Dennis Wilson's house, and part of the entertainment was Charles Manson, the cabaret act at night, and they listened, and they were interested, and also Manson provided free sex to anybody who was willing to participate, because the girls did whatever Manson said they should do.
I read in Mike Love's book that Dennis had actually seen Charles Manson kill somebody. Do you know if that's a fact or not?
I don't believe Dennis Wilson did see anybody. In my research, and I've been covering the story for 50 years, I never heard that Dennis was a witness to murder. But later on, of course, when Dennis realized that Manson was the leader of the murderous pack, mm-hmm. he was really scared, very, very worried. And in fact, Dennis Wilson had to get the Beach Boys' office to evict Manson and the girls from his mansion.
And another celebrity who was involved in the music business, Terry Melcher, the son of Doris Day, had also been a resident in that house on Cielo Drive earlier, and Manson knew him as well as his attempt to get into the music industry. So let's talk a little bit about Melcher.
Yeah, Terry Melcher was a very talented record producer. He happened to have an inside track because his mother was Doris Day, and she had clout, I think, at the Columbia Records, and so Melcher also had a good track record. He'd been with the Beach Boys. He knew the Beach Boys very well. The Byrds were a rock group that he took to fame. And so he was looking for new talent. And of course, where did he see the new talent? At Dennis Wilson's house one night, and he saw Manson, he met Manson, was impressed, and said he would audition Manson. And in fact, he did audition Manson, and gave Manson some money. When I spoke before he died to Terry Melcher said that he never promised Manson a recording contract. But an interesting twist is, at that period of time, Terry Melcher was looking for new talent for a new label owned by the Beatles. So it sort of all comes together in a strange way. And that was Melcher's connection with Manson. And of course, the point you made was that Terry Melcher and Candice Bergen, actress, model, beautiful companion, lived in the Cielo Drive house, but moved out a few months before, and in moved Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate.
So did Doris Day and Candice Bergen and Terry Melcher think that maybe Melcher and Bergen were a target, or was that?
They did. They thought the reason why Manson sent the killers to Cielo Drive was to get revenge on Terry Melcher for reneging on a promise of a recording contract. And in fact, because I interviewed Doris Day and interviewed Terry Melcher a few years later, and Doris said to Terry, now that they've arrested this guy Manson, you've got to leave the country because he obviously has a vendetta against you. And Terry said, no, he said, I'm busy with records, I can't leave. And so he moved into his mother's house in Malibu, which really didn't get him too far away. So Doris was scared. Terry was also scared when he learned that Manson was the leader of the killers and the instigator of the murders. And unfortunately, Terry Melcher never recovered from the horror, because Terry told me that he'd become paranoid after he learned that Manson was the killer, and he just ended up feeding tranquilizers, living on tranquilizers, and visiting his psychiatrist every week, and he never overcame it. He never did.
What about Candice? I know she is reluctant to talk about it.
Candice does not want to talk about it.
No.
But Candice was a sharp lady. Terry Melcher said to her, why don't you come to the ranch with me, because I'm going to give another audition. And of course, once Terry told Candice about all these near naked young women who were dancing around Manson, Candice said, it's not for me. No. If you're going to go back, I'm not going with you. And she didn't. She at least had the intelligence to stay out of it. And of course, not long after that, Candice broke up with Terry, and a lot of people think that the connection with Manson helped the break.
Yes. Well, I also know for a fact that Dennis Wilson never recovered from having had the association with Manson too. So his life, just his murders just affected so many people. And a lot of people to this day, even those that weren't involved with Manson, still have a hard time reliving that.
A lot of people today, as you point out, Francine, is that even Warren Beatty, and I know people are trying to get hold of Warren Beatty to do television documentaries. Warren Beatty is very reluctant now to talk about it. I mean, he knew Roman very well indeed. He knew Sharon. And in fact, there was a period, believe it or not, when Roman said to Warren, Warren was living in a penthouse at the Beverly Regent or Beverly Wilshire Hotel, where many of his many of his girlfriends used to visit him. Roman said, well, why don't you move into my place? There's plenty of room. And Warren said, no, thank you. I'm staying where I am. And he stayed where he did. But he was also involved in knowing all the friends of Roman, the studio people, Robert Evans of Paramount Pictures, the boss. It was a very incestuous group of people, of stars, that were linked to Sharon and to Roman.
and eventually Charles Manson. So we've got the murders. What happened after that in between the next few months? I know you covered this extensively. Take us through the next few months.
Again, the murders took place in a safe neighborhood, in a neighborhood where we would pick up hitchhikers. I would pick up hitchhikers. But after this, people just clammed up. I mean, Steve McQueen, who knew Sharon and knew Roman, went berserk, because there were also a story came out saying there was a Manson death list and Steve McQueen was on it.
Oh, good heavens.
And Steve McQueen actually went a little bit bonkers. I mean, he got a gun, he got a shotgun under the bed and a pistol under his pillow, and he really felt that they were going to come after him. And he wasn't the only one. There were many other people. Steve McQueen actually said that on the night of the murders he was going to visit Sharon because he was a friend of Sharon. Of course, he was a friend of Jay Sebring, who cut his hair. And he was going to go, his story was, he was going to go to Cielo Drive on the night of the murders. He set off on his motorcycle, and lucky for him, he met a young maiden who he gave a ride to and ended up in a motel with. That's his story. And as a result, he never showed up at the house. So there were many Hollywood people who told that story, and a lot of people told me the story. I mean, Dennis Hopper told me a similar story.
He was supposed to be there that night.
He was supposed to be there.
Right.
He was supposed to be there, but he went to the Daisy Club and got involved in the girl of the moment. And then, of course, there was John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas. And I got the story from John Phillips' friend, Mike Sarn. Mike Sarn and John Phillips were bosom buddies then. Mike Sarn was a rock singer turned film director, made a movie called Myra Breckenridge, which was a disaster at the time, but now has become a cult film. Made a movie, and John Phillips was going to write the music. So they were bosom buddies. And one night they set out from the Malibu colony where Michael was living, and were going to go and visit Sharon. And they got absolutely hopelessly drunk at a Japanese restaurant in Century City, and somehow John Phillips managed to get behind the wheel of his Rolls Royce and stagger back to Malibu colony, and they both collapsed, and they never got to the house. So,
well, that's interesting to imagine. Had all these people that said that they were on their way to the house, had they actually been there, we would have lost Steve McQueen, we would have lost Dennis Hopper, we would have lost John Phillips. We would have lost so
even
many.
Robert Evans, the head of Paramount.
Exactly.
He claimed he was going to be there. So half of Hollywood would have been decimated. I mean, I say that with a little bit of cynicism, because people like to say, Steve McQueen said it was his great escape.
Oh my. Well, it really was. It really was. Okay, so I'll tell you what, let's take a little break, and then when we come back, we're going to talk more with Ivor about the Beatles' connection to this and the aftermath, and actually the trial, because he covered extensively the trial, and you've got some great stories about that. So stay with us, and we will be right back. Hi, I'm Francine Brokaw from Beyond the Red Carpet, and I know that caregiving is something that people really have a hard time deciding on. But let me tell you, Premier Nursing and Caregiving is a company on which I have relied several times, and I really trust Marilyn and her wonderful group of caring caregivers. So I don't think you can go wrong calling Premier Nursing and Caregiving. Welcome back. We are talking today with Ivor Davis, the author of Manson Exposed, a bestseller on Amazon.
Done well, yes.
Yes, very well. And okay, so the first part we talked about Manson and how he got his group together and the murders. Let's talk about solving the case.
Well, strangely enough, the murder case was not solved until 4 months after the murders. And in a way, it was just happenstance. Here's what happened. Susan Atkins, one of Manson's early devotees and closest members of the family, had been arrested for the murder of Gary Hinman, the Topanga Canyon musician who was killed July 27th before the Sharon Tate murders.
Okay.
Miss Atkins was in the Sybil Brand Institute in downtown Los Angeles, and she started talking to two cellmates. And she started saying to them, "Do you know who killed Sharon Tate?" And of course, their cellmate said, "Oh, who did?" She said, "I did." And she started boasting. And they first of all thought she was looped out on drugs, but then she gave them meticulous details of killing, stabbing Sharon. And then they started to believe it. And it took about 2 or 3 weeks before the two cellmates said, "We've got to tell the cops." But they had a difficult time getting the ear of the police. But they finally got through to the homicide detectives, who came to see them and then came to interview Susan Atkins. And Susan Atkins spilt her guts.
She wanted to tell everybody.
She wanted to tell, she wanted to boast. And so Susan Atkins then testified to a Los Angeles grand jury, and then on December the 1st, 1969, Los Angeles Police Chief Ed Davis said, "We've solved the case, and here are the suspects." And all hell broke loose because people then realized Charles Manson and his gang were responsible for these two heinous crimes.
Okay, so actually 3 because of the Hinman.
The Hinman murders, yes.
So, but Manson himself never actually murdered anybody. So how did they get around that and convict him? That's an interesting story. I read in your book. And
well, the problem was that Manson never went to the Sharon Tate house. And that was true. He never did. He'd actually, in passing, been to the house when Terry Melcher was dropped off one day with Dennis Wilson, but he never went into the house. So, number one, he never went to the Sharon Tate house. However, he did go to the La Bianca house, because the next day he said, "Here's how you should have done it. You made a real mess of the last murders. I'm going to show you how to do it." So he drove with them to the La Bianca house. He got out, he went into the La Bianca house, he tied up the La Biancas, he came back into the car where they were waiting and sent Tex Watson, Leslie Van Houten, and Patricia Krenwinkel in to get rid of, to kill the La Biancas. And then, if you can believe it, in the car with him was also Linda Kasabian. Susan Atkins was there in the back seat. And he said, we're going back to the ranch. And he told the killers, "Hitchhike when you finished, hitchhike."
Oh my.
And they did. They hitchhiked after the murders back to the Spahn movie ranch. So that was how the murder was solved, despite what the cops said, although the cops spent hundreds of hours interviewing people. But Susan Atkins' loose lips blew the whole thing out of the water.
But it was, she meant to do that.
She did.
She did.
She was a girl. She was looking for recognition.
Right.
She was looking for notoriety. She didn't really realize, and neither did her cellmates. They thought she was bragging. They thought she was reading. She'd read the newspaper reports, but of course the detail she gave them was meticulous.
Yes.
Especially when Sharon said to her, "Spare my baby." Susan did not spare anyone.
That's
horrendous.
That's horrendous, yes. Okay, so now we've got the murders and we've got the case. Now we have to go to a trial. And you were there.
What a trial.
Yes.
It was a circus. It was crazy. And it was crazy because Manson wanted to be his own lawyer. And the judge decided that he wasn't competent to be his own lawyer. So then Manson said, if you don't think I'm competent, I'm going to get the most incompetent lawyer on the face of the earth to defend me. And for the next 9 to 10 months, every day I went into the court, I watched the trial from the second row, and it was a circus. It was unpredictable. One day Manson carved a swastika in his forehead, and then the same day the defendants did the same thing. And whenever Manson screamed at the judge, the girls screamed at the judge. Whenever Manson started singing, the girls sang. It was a disruptive trial. And what made it even worse was the incompetency of some of the lawyers. Because, to be honest with you, Ronald Hughes, the lawyer for Leslie Van Houten, who was involved and implicated in the LaBianca murders, had never handled a single case, straight out of UCLA Law School. Day Shin represented Susan Atkins. He was an immigration lawyer, never handled a major case. Manson's own lawyer, Irving Kanerick, was Mr. Obstructionist. I mean, he dragged out cross-examination for a week with each witness, and the judge was going crazy. Manson kept getting thrown out of the court for misbehaving, and on one occasion I was there, Manson got a sharp pencil and jumped at the judge saying, "You're going to die, old man." And of course the bailiff rugby tackled him.
Oh my.
And he was put in a holding cell. And whenever he played up, the girls played up. And in a way that played right into the hands of the district attorney, because the district attorney knew that the jury could see that Manson was manipulating these girls. And even if Manson didn't actually murder them, his behavior in court indicated that whenever he did something crazy, the girls copycatted him. And in a way, the jury finally, at the end of the trial, decided that the thesis that the Beatles' lyrics from the White Album, and I'll tell you about that in a moment, was the reason that they went out and killed everybody. It was crazy. The Beatles' Helter Skelter, and I mean, listen to Helter Skelter lyrics, and you will see, if you listen to the lyrics written by Paul McCartney, it has nothing to do with murder.
No.
Exhorting, none of the lyrics of the Beatles songs had anything to do with a race war, blacks killing whites, and Manson and the gang would escape to Death Valley. I mean, it is an insane idea, but the prosecutor got the jury to convict.
So Manson thought that the Beatles were speaking to him through their music to go and commit these murders and cause the race war.
Exactly. Manson brainwashed his followers, and they did everything he said he told them to do. Mm-hmm. He played the White Album. He played Helter Skelter. He played Revolution. Sexy Sadie, he said, was written by the Beatles for Susan Atkins, who was called Sexy Sadie. All the songs, Rocky Raccoon was a black, Piggies was a song written by the Beatles about the racist cops. So he made them believe, and he made them believe because he played their music at the Spahn Movie Ranch, and he fed them drugs, hallucinatory drugs, and they believed it. Because when I went to the Spahn Movie Ranch where they were all living, they told me, and I sat there boggle-minded. I mean, I couldn't believe that people would say that, because I knew the Beatles' music. Mm-hmm. I traveled with them, and I knew that why there's no way Beatle lyrics was an incitement or a blueprint for mass murder.
And you spoke with was it George or John about that?
I spoke to John Lennon about that a few years later, because John was actually, believe it or not, living in LA after he'd spent some time in LA during the trial doing primal therapy, but that's another story with Yoko. And I said to John, "What do you think?" And he said, I mean, he called him a wanker. He said it was a load of rubbish. He said, what has Helter Skelter got to do with stabbing people? Nothing.
No.
I mean, he was outraged that his music and Paul's music and the Beatle music had been usurped in such a hideous fashion. And I think the district attorney went with that theory because he could get a conspiracy conviction and get Manson convicted, and he was right. Vincent Bugliosi was absolutely right. I mean, he was a driven man, the prosecutor, and he lived that case, and he got the conviction. So I always say that the ends justified the means, and for Bugliosi, the whole Helter Skelter, Beatles made me do it theory fit, and he used it, and they convicted.
That won him the case. Do you think, having been there all that time and seen all the antics of Manson and his gang, do you think that he wanted to be convicted, or do you think that that was just him, the way he acted?
I think, I mean, he was a wannabe rock star, and he was a brilliant performer, Manson. He really was. If anybody bothers to go onto YouTube and see some of the interviews with Manson, with Diane Sawyer or Tom Snyder or Ron Reagan Jr. or Geraldo Rivera, you will see a brilliant performance. The monster is on television. You can watch him in your living rooms without being worried that he's going to jump out and kill you.
Thank God he's dead.
Exactly. So if you look at those performances, they're quite remarkable. And he knows how to captivate an audience. And so he became famous for his notoriety on primetime television. And that I think led to why we're talking about it today, because honestly, I mean, if Manson had been executed after the jury convicted him and sent him to the gas chamber, you and I would not be sitting here talking about Manson, I honestly believe.
Well, seriously, for the last 50 years, Manson has had a presence in the culture. I mean, there's been chatter about him for 50 years. It's not just now on the anniversary. We've talked about this for all these years. And it has repercussions, and obviously with those that were supposed to be there, those that knew him, they have never gotten over it, and a lot of people that lived in the area have never gotten over it. But now Hollywood seems to be catching up.
Yeah.
And what is this new movie?
Well, Quentin Tarantino has a film called Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and the title gives you the clue. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is a fairy story.
Definitely.
It's not what really happened, without spoiling it, but the film is still playing. It opened a few months ago. It's still playing. It will come up for an Oscar, I'm sure, believe it or not, maybe for Tarantino, maybe for Leonardo DiCaprio or Brad Pitt. But it captures the era brilliantly. I've got to give it to Tarantino. The mood of 1969, the music, the ambiance, and the Spahn Movie Ranch. Spahn Movie Ranch is where Manson and the girls lived, and where they went out from the movie ranch to do the murders, and they went back to the movie ranch. When I saw that film, actually my neck got prickly, because he had captured the ranch wonderfully well. And not only did he capture the ranch wonderfully well, he got the girls, the sort of mindless acolytes, these kind of sweet little girls with their sing-song voices. And it was scary. That ranch was well depicted, believe me. I was there 50 years ago, and I saw it a few months ago in the film, and it was spooky.
When you were covering all this, the Manson family knew who you were.
Yes, in fact, on the very first day of the murder trial, I'd written, believe it or not, a book before the murder trial started. And I know that they knew about the book because Irving Kinerick tried to get a change of venue because of my books, claiming that the jury pool would be would have been influenced by the book. The judge said, no way, we're going to do it in LA, and they did it in LA. And so the girls who were not involved in the murders knew me, including Lynn Squeaky Frome, who's still around. And Lynn Squeaky Frome, on the first day of the trial, came up to me, and I'll never forget this, and said in a little girl voice, do you know Ivor? And she knew my first name because she'd met me when I interviewed other members of the family at the ranch. She said, do you know what it feels like to have a knife slipped down your throat? And I realized that was a threat, and I went home. I went to the nearest phone, I should say, and called my wife and told her to leave the house with my young daughter. So
you
I knew that they
afraid.
were. I was scared.
Yeah.
I was scared because I knew what they could do, even though Manson was behind bars, even though the murderers were locked up. He had many of his acolytes who would do his bidding. Mm-hmm. And in fact, several years later, Lynn Squeaky Frome pulled a gun and tried to shoot President Gerald Ford.
Right.
So why did she do that? Did she do it to bring attention to her and to Manson? We never know.
So you don't know if Manson had somehow connected with her to try and do that? We don't know that?
No, I don't know that happened, but well, why would she do it? She wanted to get national publicity. She got national publicity. She got jailed. She's now out of jail and probably listening, watching this. Hi there, Squeaky.
We never know. Okay, now speaking, we just talked about the Tarantino movie, but you are in the process of working with which company to make a documentary?
There's a company, and it's a television company, and I forgot the name. It's Epix or somebody like that.
Epix, yeah.
Epix, yeah. And what is very interesting is that the producer and director of the movie is a lady called Leslie Chilcott, and Leslie won an Oscar for doing that wonderful documentary with Al Gore called about the environment, and I've forgotten the name of the movie.
Forgot it too. It's on the tip of my tongue.
Anyway, so she is a top-level filmmaker who is devoting a lot of her life now to do this 6-hour miniseries for television, which will be airing, I think, early in the new year. So there's that, and there's a lot of other stuff. There's podcasts. You know, I've been traveling around the country and even overseas doing interviews about the book, because believe it or not, 50 years later, there's still an interest. Although, as I mentioned a moment ago, if Manson had been executed, we probably wouldn't be talking about it.
That would have been fine with me.
Fine with a lot of people.
Yes, yes. So do you know who is involved? I know we talked about earlier that, off the air, that some people did not want to be included in this documentary.
Well, I mean, a lot of people, Gypsy was one of the members of the Manson family who got herself involved in peripheral stuff. She was involved, Gypsy Cher, Catherine Gypsy Cher. She was a member of the Manson family. She was arrested for going out to a gun shop and trying to rob the gun shop of guns and weaponry so that they could break Charlie out of prison. I mean, as crazy as that seems, she was arrested, she got sent to prison, she's out now, and she pops up from time to time talking about it. And the other woman that escaped Manson is Diane Lake, who wrote a very good book called Member of the Family. And Diane Lake came to her senses, but she was only 14 when Manson got his fingers into her.
It boggles my mind how this little man, I mean, I still call him a little man, had that much control over these people. And it's not just the women, he controlled the men too.
But he was clever with the women.
Yes.
Because whenever they came into his sights, he immediately summed up who they were and what they needed. They needed a father figure, they needed a lover, they needed somebody to understand them, they needed somebody to give them the answer to the meaning of life. They were not poor kids. They were kids from middle-class, well-to-do homes.
And he just read them and knew what they needed and gave it to them and controlled them.
He pushed every button perfectly. He learned very well in jail. He learned to survive in jail, and he used his education in prison to manipulate these young people. And that's what's difficult to understand. And people ask me, can it happen today? And I think it still happens today.
Definitely.
I mean, if you pick up the newspapers, you see some new guru who's come up with some crazy philosophy and has followers.
People they're like sponges. They just want to connect with something and eat it up, and they're looking for leadership, and Manson provided that for so many people.
He did. He did. And the amazing thing was that, I mean, you had mentioned Jim Jones earlier. Jim Jones made 900 followers swallow poison. They believed in him.
Yeah, it's just, it boggles my mind. But as I said earlier, thank God he is no longer on this earth. But I do want everybody to know about your book, Manson Exposed, because there's so much more detail in this book, and it's just mind-boggling, everything that you cover, and you've researched it so well that this is the ultimate book about Charles Manson, I have to say.
Thank you so much.
So I hope you come back again on your next book or something else we can have you back for. And I appreciate you coming down. So thanks for joining us, and thanks to Ivor, and we will see you again next time we take another look beyond the red carpet. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this little chat. If you have, please like, share, subscribe, and if you'd like to be notified of future postings, click that notification bell. Alrighty, I'll see you soon.